Hey folks, JP here, and today we're going to go over the 737 Piloting Command Initial Power Up and Safety Checklist. This is for simulation purposes only. Now, this checklist was developed using, inspired by the Mentour Aviation app. Now, if you don't know who Mentour Aviation is, he is a real-life airline pilot and airline instructor on the 737, and he does post some mini videos on Facebook for free. He also has an app where you can pay for videos where he actually gives you flight instruction videos, and it's in a 360 cockpit. He does it all live on a simulator. It's really cool. So I highly suggest you maybe check that out. The videos aren't that much, only maybe a couple of bucks for like the video packs. Like this pack that I purchased that I used to make this checklist is the cold and dark to engine start checklist pack. And he goes over the whole flow, the scan flow and everything for basically going from a cold and dark situation, which we're going to do today, to engine start. Now, in this video, this is just going to be the checklist that covers the cold and dark to initial power up and safety checklist. Now, during that time, the first officer would be outside of the aircraft doing the walk around of the aircraft. So this is like the pilots just got to the airplane, they just got to the airport, they just walked onto the tarmac. The pilot in command would enter the cockpit and initiate this procedure while the first officer was doing the walk around. So now we're just going to wait for the simulator to load up here, and it'll drop us right into the cockpit of the 737-800. The Zybo version for this simulator, because the Zybo version just has a little more immersive features than it's way more stable than the stock features. But anyways, depending on the simulator you're using and the model of aircraft you're using, some of these features may or may not be actually operable. But either way, I think this checklist will be helpful to you no matter what you're using. Now here I'm just going to verify that we are indeed in a cold and dark setup, and that all the switches are configured properly. So just give me a moment here to do that. All right, back here. Yeah, that should be good. Now we're going to start our checklist here. The first item on the checklist will be to verify all maintenance paperwork is signed off. So obviously that depends on how you want to do that. If you use something like SimBrief, you can get a flight manifest and briefing and all that, a simulated version of that for any flight that you can want to configure online for free. I highly suggest you use that if you're looking for an immersive simulator, airline simulator experience. So simbrief.com, I believe. Just sign up for free, and you can use their flight planner, and it'll spit out a whole flight manifest and everything, including the fuel and everything. I'm going to show you right now. This is what it looks like. And it gives you everything from your flight route to, it'll even tell you what, cost index to use, everything. I mean, it's very immersive. Highly recommend it for an immersive experience. The next checklist item is item number 2, which would be to notify the ground crew that the aircraft is going to be powered on. So at this point, you would tell the ground crew that you're about to initiate power on the aircraft, just so they're aware that, and maybe you would ask them to hook up ground power as well, which we're going to do right now, just so you have DC power available as well, because the battery is AC power only. And the aircraft, most of the systems require DC power. So now you can see we have our little generator parked outside with a little line or wire connected to the aircraft, giving us external power. Even though it is not yet connected, we haven't flipped the bus switch over yet, but it is available to us now. So now we're going to do the next item on the checklist, item number 3, which is bat switch to on. Now this is going to give us our DC power. And we just flip that switch to on, and you'll see everything light up like a Christmas tree. The aircraft is now powered, but with only DC power. clear that master alarm there, or the master caution rather. And the next item on the checklist is to make sure that the electrical and hydraulic pumps are off, which looks like some of them were on for some reason, so I just flipped those to off. Make sure those are all off for now, because you don't want the flight surfaces moving around and stuff hitting the ground crew unless they are aware that the pumps are active, and to make sure to stay clear of the control surfaces. Next item on the checklist is going to be to verify that the gear indicator lights are down 3 green, and then cross-check that with the lights up on top of the overhead panel. There are gear indicator lights on the front panel as well as the overhead panel, so there are 3 green up there. Plus we verified that the gear handle was down, and so that's a positive test for gear down. Next is to connect the AC power. So we do have ground power, as I mentioned earlier. If you didn't have ground power at this point, you would start the APU and then use the APU for your DC power, but that's a different checklist. We're starting the APU, so we're going to just use ground power for the purposes of this checklist, and we're just going to flip that bus switch to ground power on, and that will give us the DC power we need to continue with the checklist. And you can't hear the cockpit sounds in this video, but you'll start to hear different hums and different sounds as different systems come online as you switch through the different configurations here. And I always think that's kind of cool. Anyway, the next item on the checklist is to test the fire suppression system. And remember I talked about the scan. So we're starting in the upper left quadrant here, basically, of the upper head panel, and then we're moving down the left side of the aircraft. And so we'll be doing that throughout this checklist. So now we're moving down to the throttle quadrant portion of the left-hand side of the aircraft, or the left-hand side of the cockpit, which is where the fire suppression switch is, which we'll be going to here momentarily. There we go. We're going to go down here and we're going to test the fire. The first test is to flip it to the left. The test fire switch, we're going to flip it to in-op fault check. Then we're going to make sure that those 2 lights here illuminate. And there, you can see those 2 lights do illuminate. That's a positive test. Now we're going to flip it the other way, and we're going to get an audible fire alarm, as well as all of the fire lights, engine overheat lights. They should come on, and that is a positive test for the fire suppression system for the engines and the APU. See, we had an audible warning, which you maybe couldn't hear, but you would hear that when you do this checklist in real life. We can clear that master caution again. Next item on the checklist is to check the fire panel lights. Just did that. Okay, I'm sorry. Step 9 would be we're going to check the fire squibs now for engine 1 and engine 2. That's on the opposite side of this same panel here, right over here. And there's a left and right side, engine 1 and engine 2. Engine 1, 3 green, positive test. 2, 3 green, positive test. Engine squibs are good, or fire squibs are good rather. Now we're going to move back up to the overhead panel, and we're going to make sure that the cabin utility switch is to on. Over here on the left hand side, you'll see it says there it is, cabin utility. So we make sure that's on, and the IFE pass seat, that's on. Is going to be to check the powers, so the DC and AC power. So I like to switch the left-hand knob there to bat, the right-hand switch to whatever power supply you're using. We're using ground power now. If you're using APU, you'd switch it to APU and just check there and make sure you have 0.1 amp DC, 29 amps DC volts. That's good. 113 AC volts. Everything looks good there. The next item is we're going to arm the emergency lights. There we flip the emergency lights to armed, make sure it's gated. Next is to test cabin attendant and ground crew call buttons. So we're just going to give those a press, and they will give an audible tone for each one, at least in the Zybo 737 flight model it does. And in other flight models I'm sure it does as well, but you will get an audible tone, and that is a positive test if you do. Next, we will be checking the verify flaps up, cross-check with flaps indicator gauge. So we'll be moving back down to the front panel and back to the throttle quadrant. Flaps lever. Verify, yes, it is indeed up. Flaps are up. And it corresponds with the gauge there, which reads flaps up. And the next item is going to be push throttle to up. So we're going to put the throttle up to around 60-70% N1, even though the engines are not engaged right now. And then we're going to get a takeoff warning config. And that's what we want to hear. We're just testing the takeoff config warning system. And there we go. We get a takeoff warning config, an audible tone, as well as a light that says takeoff warning or takeoff config. There we go. So that is a positive test. Next, we are going to check stabilizer trim switches are set to normal and they are gated. We're going to move down to the bottom of the throttle quadrant here. The stabilizer trim switches are set to normal and they are gated. That is the proper configuration for those switches. Next item is to check the rudder trim. Now, you do other stuff in a real airplane, but here I've just checked to make sure the rudder trim is set to 0. And the next, we're going to test the PA. Now, how you do this is up to you. In the Zybo 737 here, I like to just go over to the little panel here, and I'll press the PA announcements. I'll press the captain welcome announcement just to, give a little announcement over the PA just to kind of test it.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, flight deck, welcome aboard to Mentour Aviation, leaving the first leg.
If you do not, then you're just kind of role-playing captain.
Three wonderful flight attendants,
maybe
give
give
them their
a
attention as
real
we
quick,
push
testing 1, 2, 3,
attention
something
and ready.
like that.
Enjoy the flight, we'll talk to you once airport.
Next is the verify manual gear door is closed. So right behind the first officer here, there is a door where the manual gear release is located. Now that door has to be closed unless you have to use that system, but during the checklist you open it, verify it's closed, latched. That is the emergency gear release switches in there that you could use if the gear would not go down by the manual or by the automatic process, rather. Next is to test the Mach airspeed warning. Now we're back up to the overhead panel, right side this time. We did left, we did center, now we're center overhead panel right. So Mach speed test. It's going to be just trying to get a better view here. There we go. I'll move it up a little bit. And there we go. We have our Mach airspeed warning test, number 1 and number 2. We're going to go ahead and press those in, and it will give us an audible tone for each one if it is working. And it does. We got number 1, gives us an audible tone. Next, we're going to check the test stall warning, number 1 and 2, so the stick shaker. So we press these in for each side, and it will give us a stick shaker. It doesn't say pull up, or anything like that. It just activates the stick shaker just to make sure the stick shaker is working. So there we go. Stick shaker 1 does activate. Stick shaker number 2, press that in. It does activate. That's a positive test. Next, we're going to flip the voice recorder to on. Now that is not simulated in this flight model, but the voice recorder is there. It's just inoperative. But you can assume that's basically an automatic system. In real life, there is an on-off switch, but you wouldn't ever really. I guess you would turn it on and then maybe turn it off after flight, but that's it. Maybe push a rate. I'm not sure. Yes, but in the checklist, you would turn that on at this point, and then we're gonna go test the flight recorder now. So that is simulated. If you go up there, it says flight recorder. Open that, flip to test. That light goes off. That's the only indicator you get in this simulator. Anyways, you would get some warnings down here in real life, but simulator, that light goes off. It is a positive test. Then we're just going to flip that back to normal and make sure it's gated. And that's the normal configuration for that system. Next, we're going to check the PAX and crew O2, or the passenger and crew O2. Make sure that everything's topped off. Make sure the switch is set to normal, not to on, because we don't want the oxygen masks falling down behind us before the passengers have even boarded. So just making sure that's normal and gated. Next, we're going to set the IRSs, or the inertial reference system, to nav, which is going to start the alignment process for that. And if you're not sure what that is, the inertial reference system is basically the aircraft's GPS system. It's a very advanced GPS system, and you have two of them because it's a redundant system. You have a left side and a right side, and those have to be aligned every time you turn them off. They have to be realigned. So we're going to set that to nav, which is going to, and we're going to wait for the white light to come up that says align. And we know they're now aligning, and that process takes between 5 to 7 minutes, something like that, for those to align. And in the meantime, we're going to wait for our first officer to call the flight deck, and at some point he'll ask you to turn on the hydraulic and the electrical pumps so he can make sure those are properly functioning, and also to possibly check the flight control surfaces. So you are going to notify the ground crew that you are going to, or at least once the first officer calls the flight deck and asks you to turn on those pumps, you're going to notify the ground crew that you're going to turn the pumps on. And I did forget one step. So before that, last thing you're gonna do is verify that the charts and documents are present and available to you. So whether it be your flight manifest or any legal documents you need, or navigational charts like we went through earlier, showed you we have charts for the airport there. As you can see, that's the airport we are currently at, the ground chart, our flight manifest, our departure plate, our arrival plate, just everything that we're going to need. And so that's basically what the captain would be doing at this point in the flight. After he turned the IRSs to nav, while he's waiting for those to align, because he really can't do anything else without the first officer and without the inertial reference system aligned. He's just going to be checking his paperwork, making sure everything's signed off, making sure the proper amount of fuel has been loaded onto the aircraft, maybe talking to the ground crew, talking to the fuel guys, the maintenance guys, just talking to maybe the flight crew, just making sure everything. And then moving forward again, so the first officer will contact the cockpit and say, please turn on the hydraulic and electrical pumps. You might flip on the navigation light, or the anti-collision light as it's called in the 737, just to make sure that everybody outside has a visual cue that the aircraft is now powered on and that the hydraulic and the electrical pumps are active, so the flight controls may possibly be moving, so everybody knows to stay clear of the control surfaces. And you'd also give the ground crew that's working with your plane specifically a verbal warning. You'd call them with that ground crew call button and let them know, hey, I'm going to be turning on the electrical and hydraulic pumps, to just let them know that they need to stay clear of the flight control surfaces from then on. So there we go. We're going to flip on the nav light or anti-collision light. I'm going to go ahead and flip those pumps on. the electrical and hydraulic pumps for both A and B. And then we can go to an outside view, and then we can see our nav lights on there blinking red, and we can move the flight surfaces now. You know, it looks like we have some spoilers deployed. That must have happened at some point while I was testing the throttle for the takeoff config, but that's no big deal. We can just go ahead and set that back to down. Go back into the cockpit here and just fix the spoilers. There we go. Oh, there's our fuel truck. Or, well, I guess the guy next door's fuel truck, not ours. But yes, and now we have the nav light on, and the flight control surfaces are free to move now because the hydraulic pumps and electrical pumps are active. And you will also hear an audible hum. So the hum again will change once you turn the pumps on. And if you're ever in a real airplane, you can always hear that. I always hear it when I'm in a plane now. You can hear when they turn on the fuel pumps, and also when they turn on the hydraulic pumps and the electrical pumps. If they're not already on when you board the plane, you can hear it because they have a very distinctive hum to them. And if you're ever in an Airbus flying and you hear that, it almost sounds like a barking dog where it goes woo, 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 woo. That's actually the fuel pump starting. So when they start up the engines, and I believe Airbus pilots actually call it the barking dog because it does sound like a barking dog. It's funny. Anyways, so that is the initial safety and startup checklist for the 737. Again, at this point, after you turned those pumps on, you may be going with the flight of going through some other checklist for the external walk around with the first officer. He might ask you to move the flight control surfaces so he can visually confirm that they are moving, that they're free and clear, and that there's no issues with that. But other than that, you're waiting for the first officer to complete his walk around and then to rejoin you in the cockpit. And then at that point, you can continue on with the checklist. Once the IRSs are aligned, I guess, while you're waiting for the first officer, you probably could program the FMC, which I'll probably do in a separate video of how to program the FMC in the 737 if you're in a flight model that simulates the FMC. And maybe set the autopilot up, just do some basic configuration. But you need the first officer to do the next part of the checklist, or the next checklist, which is the configuration to start checklist. Anyways, this is JP, and hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be signing off.